So, very excited about our next presenter. I met our next presenter because Verona gave me a challenge. And she sent this girl from the Bronx, who lives in Virginia now, and said, I want you to help me put on a screening, a documentary screening in Chicago. I'm like, okay. It's like, will you accept this challenge? Doom, 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 doom. So I go, okay. And so I work with some orthopedic surgeons over there and their staff, and they said, you need to talk to this guy. You need to talk to this guy. And I'm like, okay. So I start to talk. I go in there, and he's a very busy man. So he was running late, he's running back and forth as he usually is, boom, 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 because he's got a lot to cover. So I go into his office, and I meet him, and it was this instant rapport. And I said to him, I really need your help. And I start to give him my one line about, this is movement is life, and we're trying to do blah, 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 and we're trying to work with blah, blah, blah. And he's like listening, okay. He's probably thinking, what is this crazy woman? How quickly can I get her out of here? And I'm like, I'm from the Bronx, and I'm trying to make this connection. And so he said, well, when do you need to do this? He said, next week. And I said, no, because in his eyes, he could have pulled this thing off next week, because that's how connected he is. So I said, in 2 months. And he worked with me. He set his team up to work with me, and we had the best turnout on a documentary. So I knew he was the man. He was the man. So I have stayed connected with Dr. Winn, and I want you to know a little bit, because I did some research like Frank was trying to do about the speakers. And so I found out that Dr. Winn really hails from Buffalo, New York. So he's New York, so that's a good link for me. And he shares that his first career choice, his dream was to be the youngest foreman at General Motors. What a loss that would have been for medicine. So he had some divine intervention, and he met with two priests, a Father Walters and a Father Austin, at the University of Notre Dame. And in some ways, they decided for him that he was going to be a physician, because he hadn't seen minority physicians when he was growing up. So he never really thought that that was a choice for him. And that does happen to a lot of people of color. When you don't see providers, you don't think that's an option for you to choose. So he did take their advice. He did fall in love with medicine, and he wanted to become a primary care physician, but he felt a huge adrenaline rush working in the pulmonary critical care arena. And he followed his passion, and he became a pulmonary critical care physician. Today, he wears many hats, and he believes that the whole physician looks towards the future while understanding the present. He shared, and I quote, if we don't look towards the future, how do we get new doctors to take care of patients, and how do we come up with new cures? If you ask Dr. Winn, what is the philosophy that guides his professional work? Bottom line, do good for other people. He sees a physician as being a lifelong servant to others. If he's doing that well, then everything else falls into place. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Robert Winn.
Can you hear me now? So this is going to be an interesting talk, particularly in light of some issues or some changes. But I'm going to move ahead with it and say, say the following. What I'm going to talk about, I think, actually really matters for a number of Americans, all of us. And in fact, part of this talk is going to be about precision medicine. You would say, well, why are we talking about precision medicine with arthritis and muscles? It turns out that as Mr. Case and others were talking about, we have had, the 20th century was marked by, well, we do the same for everybody. And we understood that because there was a lot of not doing the same for everybody, which got us there in the first place. So in this case, what we're going to talk about is the promise really of the future. And one of the promises of the future is that, for example, no more do we have to look, say, at a woman with stage 4 breast cancer and say, you know what, I'm really glad that you've had this life. Would you be interested in going to Disney World or to Alaska? We can now say with some sense of confidence, listen, if we can understand you a little bit better, you, the individual, a little bit better, we might be able to do something. Proof positive of that is a couple patients of mine who have been around for 12 to 14 years post their stage 4 diagnosis because they had a type of mutation, a HER2/neu, that we can now target. This concept of one size fits all actually has resulted in somewhat of a medicine that I call, probably 50 years or 20, maybe even less than that, maybe 20 years from now, they'll look back and say this was the bare skins and sharp knives sort of era, where we essentially took a brick and we just did it for everybody because we didn't really see us, right? So the underpinning of this is this movement towards, honestly, being to say person-based medicine that's precise to actually help us. And I believe that there are some definite benefits to that. However, I come from a neighborhood where there was significant mistrust of medicine, mistrust certainly of science, and to be quite honest with you, that mistrust in some ways was warranted. So as a physician scientist, and in fact, to be honest with you, I've told some of my students that if loving science is wrong, then I don't want to be right. Now, part of what we're going to do is to figure out that intersection of how science can benefit literally all of us to sort of make our lives either healthier or to at least let us know about ourselves. Now, we will be talking about populations of people, but I'm also going to get this down to people who are individuals. So I have to start with, you can't move forward without looking back in some ways, and we have to talk about Tuskegee. So people sort of wonder, in wonderment, young docs will say, well, why wouldn't you want this miracle cure? Or why wouldn't you want this drug? And I can tell you today, even on the south side of Chicago, where I am as a cancer center director and a associate vice chancellor of health affairs for what are called community-based practices, fancy term for I oversee all of the federally qualified health centers or community health centers on the southwestern sides that are affiliated with the University of Illinois. I think I'm probably the only cancer center director that really, when he says I'm going to be going from the bench beyond the bedside, which many people can't get to the communities, I mean it. And that is what we're building out, this sort of bench to community model. But before I can build out a bench to community anything, we have to deal with the past. And this past, most of you know the story between Henrietta Lacks and Tuskegee. So let's talk about Tuskegee just for a minute. We have a number of people back in the 1930s when this had a bright ideal of being able to understand this sexually transmitted disease, syphilis, so that we would all benefit. We would all benefit from the knowledge of this study so that we might help out mankind and womankind. The interesting part about this study is that, yes, there were men who actually had syphilis. There were other people who were inoculated with syphilis, and we all understand that. The interesting part about this study, though, is that the things that actually keep me sort of going and making sure that we always appreciate the power of science, but that it's always integrated in the context of the ethics of science and what we're trying to do with it, is this study. Interestingly enough, even when they came up with the cure, and we knew for certain that penicillin and other things would actually work for these men in this trial, we chose not to. In fact, because the purity of understanding the study took precedence over everything, we did. The interesting thing about this is that we also learned about what happens to their spouses and the children that were born from these men who, interesting enough, didn't sign up for this study. Now, these men actually thought that they were doing something good. They thought they were going to get free health care because that's what they were told. You're going to get free health care. Many of you know this story. And for those of you who don't, this may be new to you, but this is what happened, and this is why you have your IRBs and everything else. We'll talk about that real quick, too. These men were said, you'll have burial costs for you, and you'll have free health care, except for the treatment of your syphilis. Because we need to understand the whole progression of the disease. Interesting enough, just to fast forward, these studies lasted all the way up until the 70s. In fact, most of these men, even during World War II, wanted to sign up, but they couldn't to fight in the war because they couldn't. They were like, our subject's too important. Interesting enough, some of these men, a really cool story was, this was in Alabama, tried to go to Mississippi or other places to, once they figured out they could get treatment, but were on a registry. So they couldn't get treatment. It is not lost on me, the power of science. It's not lost on me where we are these days and what we're going to be capable of. In some ways, it keeps me excited about what we can potentially do for future musculoskeletal diseases and for other things in a context of how big data can be used and science data could be used to help people that we currently can't. But in the back of my mind, always, is that just because you have a great tool doesn't mean that the people who some of these other tools have been used on are just going to readily line up for a wonderful new molecular therapy. That trust has to be earned. The story about Henrietta Lacks, and I'll just quickly go through that one, is an interesting story as well, right? Everybody has read the book about Henrietta Lacks, her family. We've met them. In my role in the precision medicine, we've met her family, and they're wonderful people. But this concept of being able to take something from a patient and make really millions and millions of dollars, unlocking the secrets really of her interesting cells, which, by the way, when I was in medical school at University of Michigan, I didn't know her name was Henrietta Lacks. They were calling her something. I was like, who? Right? But the fact that we could figure out from her cells that we can start getting an interesting line of how cancer worked. Whether you're talking musculoskeletal cancer, bone cancer, whatever, how cancer in general would work was fascinating and literally came from the contribution of her life and her cells. Cells which we today use commonly in many places throughout the entire world. Jonas Salk and others have used her cells to actually figure out how to make real impact on human beings and humankind. So it is not lost on me, and I come to you humbly, talking about what I believe is really the next thing, the next tool that I think can have a huge impact on us. And you will hear a lot about it, potentially, in the context of what we call person-based medicine. I like to call it that, or precision medicine. So we've spent the better part of the 20th century under the guise of two things, principles: scientific discovery and the quest for having purity of data, right? So that's what the 20th century, in my mind, was made of. This is the first time, and under President Obama, and I really have to sort of respect much of what he's done, but this for certain is one of the things that I have a great amount of respect for in his drive, not the United, his drive to say, what can we do for and with people? And in fact, this context of this precision medicine initiative, which we will hear much about, and he led this, is really, as you can sort of see there, how can we be more beneficial to everybody by figuring out how to more precisely treat them. He too was well aware of the things that have been done to people. So with his drive and his vision, if you've not seen the 7-minute clip, you really ought to take a look at that. It is fantastic under the precision medicine from the president's office. It's him. It's not someone else, not a surrogate. It's him talking about why he believes that this is good for all of us. Now, as we think about the precision medicine, It really is, I mean, you can read all that, but the precision medicine really, to me, represents the best of what we can do. And that is, how can we take each other as a population, as a group, as an African American, if you will, as a Latina, but how can we also figure out within those groups individuals? Because we talk sometimes about African Americans as if all African Americans are going to respond to the same drug and all Caucasians. There's not, right? There's going to be variability. You'll have groups of Caucasians that'll be responders and non-responders to certain therapy, and you'll have groups of Latinos and everybody who will respond and not respond. Our job is to figure out how best to get the best medicine to you. Now, it's not lost on me, too, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, that in an era of big data, what people really like to do, and it's great to see epidemiologists and epigenetic people sitting around the table because they're hilarious to me because they keep talking big data. In fact, they keep talking bigger data that begets even bigger data. And they get bigger data. And then once I sort of said, well, what do you do with this big data? How will it actually affect the alderman that's right in the 27th Ward right here down the street from my university, my hospital? And the best answer I got was, I don't. I was like, you don't know? Okay, right? But again, this is a movement. This is something that I believe, this precision medicine, that is really trying to take the best spirit of getting information and getting it to be useful to people. Now, Eric Dishman is now the head person over the precision medicine. I'll tell you quickly, I talk all day about this guy, but he is a former, chief exec and all the rest of that stuff from Intel, whose life was changed when he actually had renal cell carcinoma himself, was diagnosed at a very young age, and was told, there is no therapy. We don't know what to do with you. Don't know what to do with you. In fact, he was privileged enough, and he admits that, to actually have families and others that kept pushing until he wound up going to a university that wound up doing its precision, person-based medicine sort of movement, and actually figured out that he was very different and incredibly unique, but that, yes, they indeed had a therapy that would work for him. Again, a precise therapy that would work for him. And multiple years later, he is now the leader of what he believes in as well, person-based medicine, and is doing quite well. Status post his kidney transplant. Recently just saw him in DC. He's doing pretty awesome. Why do I say this? Because there are some basic principles that if this program didn't have it, I don't think many of us would sign on to it. And that is that the participation should be open to all. Most of our studies have not been, but this should be open to all people. Second, that, to be honest with you, and I can read the list, it should be diverse. And we're talking geographic, we're talking lots of different kinds of diversity. The other thing is, participants, honestly, should be partners. People should be at the table. In some ways, at the beginning of these studies, or all the way to the arc of the end. But having our voice at the table really is important. It also is important that as a participant, you have access to your own data. How crazy is it that we would ask you to give up your most precious of information, which is your DNA, your genomic data, and not have access to it? Now, I will share a funny story with you. When I was in a barber shop recently, and someone said to me, we've been doing this thing, talking around, and one of the guys sort of said, now listen, Dr. Winn, if I give you my DNA sample, let's just say I had been somewhere, and let's just say someone said I had stole something, could my DNA be used to track me down? It was something that came out of left field, but I was like, I had not thought about that. But the real answer to that is, there is this effort to make sure that the information that is here is absolutely protected. And they're working overtime to figure out how to do that, how you can access your own, and how you all have the right to say no. I want my information removed. That's real participation. That's nothing close to what we had in Tuskegee. 600 men who were told, lied to essentially, You'll have free health care, and they did. So if they had a heart attack, they took care of it. If they had a stroke, they kind of took care of it, except for if the stroke was related to the syphilis, and they were like, well, right? Different ball of wax. We're making certain that the information is private and secure, and many of the patients, and as we talk about health disparities, and many of your patients, as we deal with obesity, as we deal with all these other issues, this, again, matters. Does all medicines work the same? We don't know. That's what we're going to find out. Hopefully, we hope that this program is going to be a catalyst for change. And regardless, I'm going to stick with it all the way to the end. Now, this won't move forward, but maybe I'm doing something wrong. Okay. Now, why is this important? This is important because we're asking Americans to do something that we have never asked before. The largest cohort study that I know of on record is roughly about 100,000 people. We're asking people, regardless of your condition, regardless of how healthy or how unhealthy you are, to be a part. We're looking, I think, and again, I always talk about the audacity of the president to do certain things, and I'm thinking back at the audacity of him to sort of say, I think we can get 1 million people. And in fact, unfortunately, on those good days, he had me thinking, I think we can get 1 million people. So we agreed to participate. The whole concept is, can we get enough information so that information becomes ours? And that means the collective ours, all the folks that are in this room, that we generate the next group of not just scientists, but I'm going to use the word here, and I know, some people may say, well, I don't believe in that, but we believe in that. That's citizen scientists, meaning that you don't have to have a PhD. You shouldn't have to have a PhD to look at data from folks in your own neighborhood or from you. You should be able to look at that as well. That is also part of this program, ensuring that it's not just people with MD, PhDs who are looking at all these things, but it's us. Now, the diversity that we're talking about really is going to include, on principle, health status. People with different kinds of arthritis, rheumatoid, degenerative, different kind of bone disease, asthma, non-asthma, healthy people in the context of the health meaning that they are not, or they're disease-free, at least at the moment, all will be invited. There'll be certainly an effort to even, in a way, and I know this may not be popular now, but I'm going to continue to say it now, next year, and as long as the program is running, there is going to be an effort to get an oversampling of women who are traditionally not in studies and underserved minority populations in our studies. In fact, there is an intent to try to, even in some cases, depending on the state, to get an oversampling of those populations so that we know that the medicines we give you work. We know, for example, in women that Ambien may or may not work, probably doesn't work. We've seen a 60-minute thing, that it doesn't work the same. We need to know that. We need to know, for example, that if I'm giving you a drug, it's not doing you some harm. You, in the context of your population, but you as an individual. That is where my excitement for the 21st century is going, in the context of not only scientific discovery, but how do we get that science and how do we get it implemented to real folk? That is the excitement of the 21st century. And by hook or by crook and with all my energies, that is what I will be fighting for until my last breath, for sure. Now, the interesting thing is, this project I would not have participated in, and many of us would not have participated in, if we didn't first and foremost say, how do we get the community at the table? So the beautiful part about this is that we've, from the very inception of this project, have gotten voices directly from the community to sort of guide. It says, how you gonna get what? Who you gonna get to spit where? No. You wanna do a questionnaire? Good. How many pages? 200. That's what no, really, that was the first one. Now listen, I told the person who was coming up with the 200, I go, that might be good for some epidemiological stuff, but the people in my neighborhood on the south and west side off there on 63rd and King ain't gonna fill out no 200-page. It's not gonna happen, right? Real talk. Talking about having the community keeps us from doing silly things like, well, everybody will have their laptop. Or we can do everything on their cell phone. To which once I responded in the middle of a meeting, it was all a bunch of really smart people. So, occasionally I had to let the hood come out every now and again. So as we were talking and hypothesizing about how we're going to reach these populations and the sophistication of their cell phone, I just wanted to test the water. So I said, so what do we do about the burners? The what? Dr. Winn, the burners? Yeah, everybody ain't got no AT&T service, right? Some folks got cricket, sometimes for a month, sometimes for a week. What are we going to do about that? So there becomes this real conversation that, again, was able to be introduced into this conversation because, not me, but because the community was there. That is something that I hope we all go forward in recognizing that as we are MD, PhD, MBA, MPHs, and all the above, and we may have come from some of those neighborhoods, but there's nothing like having people from the neighborhood with you at the table from the community while you design your projects. That is something that I really love about this program. Now, it is true, I am a physician scientist, so people say the following. In fact, when I first came to Chicago, they go, wait a minute. You are a physician scientist running a basic science laboratory, which is true. I do love the transcriptome and other things like that. We could talk about that offline, and I can go on and on till the break of dawn with that. True. But it also is interesting that I am also the product of a 15-year-old mom who is not ashamed that Miss Verda, my mom, actually did the best she could with raising me in the projects. Now, when we talk about the American dream and all the rest of these things, we don't recognize that some of the throwaway kids, what they call Head Start kids and all the rest of these things back in the day, may be the very same kids. If you do enough shaking and baking, you put them in the right institutions, it might be the people who can figure things out too. Now, as we're figuring things out, it is not good enough just to figure things out for the few. We need to figure it out for all of us. And the new campaign, interesting enough, I'll share with you, has gone from precision medicine to all of us, a precise way of moving forward and doing medicine, which I really like. Now, I'm going to give you a couple examples, and then I'm going to end with I hope, a couple really cool sort of examples. Populations. Why do populations matter? So I'm going to give you a quick example of why person-based, precise medicine matters. Now, most of you know the one, drug called Lipitor. They had crazy commercials on it. When Lipitor was running hot, tell me this is not, I know, I could ask, does anybody not know what Lipitor is? And that's what I thought. Lipitor, drug lowering cholesterol? Yeah. That was a wonderful drug when it came out. People talked about it, they raved about it. It's going to lower your cholesterol. It's a miracle drug. Interesting enough, no one ever checked in the context of its use in Asians. Because one size fits all, right? One size fits all. It turns out that, interesting enough, in Asian populations, this drug Lipitor, this miracle drug, was kind of not exactly a miracle. It turns out that they were getting significant side effects from it, very little benefits, because we hadn't recognized that the cytochrome P450, which is just how you metabolize drugs, was just a little bit different enough that actually by using lower doses, you were able to reduce the side effects and increase the benefits. That's called precise medicine. Understanding that populations, that's not to say that all Asians would respond the same, but it's to have enough data to figure out that populations may not respond the same to our brick on sale sort of approach where we define this medicine that works in the 75 kg, Caucasian man who's roughly about 50. And then we say, go forth and this is what we do. Precision, by definition, means precision and precise for you. Now, the next example I think is a great one. I love this one. Now, again, just for sake of argument, I got that picture from a friend because they were too cute. So I just put it up. These are not the sisters, it's just their picture. They were too cute. Yeah, full transparency. Not only does the population you belong to matter, that would define how a drug might be used, but where you live would also have an impact on whether drugs would work for you. And the best example is these two sisters. You know, they love each other. You could see them, right? They were raised together in the same home. They were raised in the same town, under the same circumstances. And as all kids grow up, they subsequently moved on, went to different colleges, and settled in different places. The story goes that, and this is a map of Illinois, one sister, finds someone, and she moves to the Gold Coast, which is, the name says it all. Right in the Gold Coast, there's also the Magnificent Mile. It's one of the more affluent areas in Chicago. And in fact, if you look at the number of universities, the number of hospitals, if you look at the number of what we call our farmer markets that actually kind of happen, the availability of fresh foods, if you look at the stress and all the rest of that, one would sort of say that that's a fairly good area to live in. The other sister winds up moving to Molina. Now, interesting enough, Molina is an interesting place in that there is a significantly higher level of poverty. There isn't the same availability of fresh foods. There isn't the same availability of hospitals and clinics. And interesting enough, there's not even the same availability when it comes to parks and other places where you can exercise or do these things that her sister could. They both, again, from the same genetic background, they both developed breast cancer. The question becomes, do you treat them the same? Now, when one thinks about that, you would say, of course, they're sisters. But we now know that where you live matters. There's something called the microbiome. And again, for your obesity, arthritic, musculoskeletal, I know we're probably not thinking about this, but the microbiome, as it comes to healing, when you do things, this microbiome means the food, the very food that you have access to, that you eat, has a way of affecting your genetics in a way that could either harm you or help you. In some ways, the microbiome, the very food we have access to, could put you potentially at risk for certain cancers or for certain diseases or benefit. Moline versus Gold Coast, I guarantee you, is very different in what the food access is. Interesting enough, I failed to mention that while the Gold Coast had some of the lowest rates of not only breast cancers, but you can look at all the cancers. You can look at all the cancers and all the diseases, it's going to be low, low, and low. Not true in Moline. Predominantly a Caucasian area that has 2.5 times the mortality, the death rate of breast cancer compared to her sister who lives in Chicago. Second, if you really believe that the environment, now some of this my grandma would tell me, I love talking to my grandma because I bring these big things up and she'll say, mm-hmm. She go, well, of course the food you eat is going to do something. I'm like, all right. All right. She goes, you went to school for that? I'm like, well, yeah. So when I told my grandma, I thought I was telling her something new about something called the epigenetics. I go, Grandma, I'm figuring it out. I'm doing the study, and I got groups working on this now about epigenetics and how the epigenetics can actually, meaning, Grandma, the stresses that you live in the environment and the violence that you're exposed to and all these things can actually, epigenetics mean on top of your genetics, but they can affect your genes in a way that they can actually cause risk of cancer. Epigenetics. contributing to disease. And in my grandma's fashion, she said, I don't know what all that means, but you know what? You know people probably get more cancer when they stressed out. Right? I'm just keeping it real for a minute. But I did go to school and could dress it up. But my point is that it's not just anymore thinking about populations of people. When you think about your patients that you take care of, when you think about our communities that we take care of, it's not enough just to think about the populations. Well, we'll just break this down to African Americans, we'll break this down to Latinos, we'll break this down to just women, right? The truth of the matter is it's actually more complicated, which is why we have to step up to the challenge and putting our arms around how we can figure out harnessing our knowledge that we have about ourselves for good. You'll hear a lot more about microbiome, and you'll hear a lot more about epigenetics, the epigenetic modification of diseases. Because it turns out, interestingly enough, a kid that lives on 63rd and King, which is probably one of the more violent areas right now in Chicago, certainly is going to have probably a difference in the prostate outcome in cancer than someone who lives probably right off of Michigan Ave and goes to Jones High School. It's a fact. It's no longer just about race. It's not longer just about gender. It's the and conversations. It's race and gender and where you live. The individualization about you. This is what I really love about what the president has brought forth. So the old way of doing business, and I'm going to be wrapping up fairly soon, the old way of doing business is you have an investigator like me. And we say, I'm going to recruit 5,000 people because I really want to know about arthritis. Just got to know. I'm going to recruit 5,000 people, and from these 5,000 people, I'm going to figure out what's going on. That is what we have been doing. The precision medicine movement argues that what if, not or, but what if we also had 1 million, and we're hoping to have more, people that were already Americans, already rolling up their sleeves, giving us their spit, giving us a little bit of their blood. We can have a data bank so that we can actually go and say, you know, I think we already have data that could look at not only this population, but people who may live in these types of community could benefit from this drug as opposed to the other. The two sisters that I told you about, interesting enough, it is very possible that one sister would respond to a therapy, even with the same genetic background, and the other would not, because of the stresses in their life, because of the foods that they eat. And so it is not a foregone conclusion that they respond the same. That's the power, I think, of where we're potentially going. Now, there's two methods of collecting this data. I'm just going to give you the nuts and bolts, and then I'm going to wrap things up. The nuts and bolts are that we have the traditional centers like mine, University of Illinois, along with Northwestern. We call ourselves the Illinois Precision Medicine Consortium. We'll be able to have places within the community that we're able to engage the community in getting their material. But we've also had something freaking really cool in which we're calling it the direct volunteers. That is, training people who, on their own, community groups, with the standards that are going to be set, that could go into barbershops and beauty salons and other places. Not only just to collect blood, but to actually figure out what the community's like. What's the fresh foods there? What's the availability of clinic sites? What kind of parks do they have around? It's kind of cool. Now, there are some elements, and this part I'll just go through quickly. There's going to be a data research support center, a biobank, meaning that if you collect all this stuff, where are you going to put it? Participant technologies, which is the part that really works on participant privacy. Healthcare provider organizations, which will include our federally qualified health centers, which we really argued that this shouldn't be just in your esteemed Northwestern universities, University of Chicago's and Stanford's, but they should be out in the community as well. And the best representation of our communities are our federally qualified health centers. And the VA, by the way, which has the Million Vets program that's actually ongoing. The Data and Research Support Center is being led by Vanderbilt. The biobank is being led by Mayo. The participant technologies is being led really by Script, and there are other people that are helping out with that. And as we talk about our centers, the very first 4 centers, and I was lucky, our institution was lucky enough to be one of the first 4 centers that led the way for this precision medicine initiative. But they include a group up in New York, Columbia Cornell, Harlem Hospital, a group out in Pittsburgh, a group in Arizona, which had an incredibly high rate of access to Native Americans, which I thought was great to make sure that we are including everyone in the study, and us in little old Illinois, which was not just Chicago, but included southern parts of Illinois, and I mean some very, very rural places. The kind that have cows that just seem to be walking around. I had to get used to that. It's okay though. It is the land of Lincoln, but that's okay. So as we talk about the Illinois Precision Medicine Consortium, it's made up of Northwestern, University of Illinois, and University of Chicago, and we have other partners. The HPOs also, and again, wearing my federally qualified health center hat, really made sure that this wasn't just some sort of academic exercise, but we got this out to where the people are. And so we have a number of federally qualified health centers that are actually helping us to participate in this and helping us to think through about how do we get data, who do we get data from, how do we get participants, and how do we approach those participants, and the VA. Now, there's a bunch of scientific opportunities that we could talk about, but the biggest one for me is the development of new knowledge that can ultimately help us all. Help design drugs for you. Help make approaches that are right for you as an individual and for you as whatever groups, because they usually intersect. It's usually now a single group. Now, why all of us should take more an active part in clinical trials and the PMI? Here's why. Now, y'all didn't know this, or maybe, well, I should probably raise your hand. How many people knew that 2016 was the year of diversity in clinical trials? So we got, okay, 2, 3, 4, okay. So we've been doing a great job with that. Yeah. So much so that when I actually heard that, I go, what are we going to do other than have an article or 2, right? But at least it's on our mind. And at least people are at least putting it out there that this was the year of diversity in clinical trials. But going all the way back, again, taking that look back to go forward, it's not enough just to say, well, we want to have diversity in clinical trials without actually going back and grappling with our past. Interestingly enough, I've seen multiple academic institutions, multiple people present, and everyone talk about the wonderfulness of their program, but no one grapple with the past of what we did in Puerto Rico with women in the context of pregnancy, trying to figure out, again, what the birth control pill would do or wouldn't do. But we obviously needed somebody, so we just go to Puerto Rico because they're expendable, right? We have to be able to sort of, as scientists, as clinicians, as human beings, and as people who want to do good, we have to be able to sort of talk about the past so that we can move forward. Because it is a wonderment to my 20-year-old somethings, med students, who go into the neighborhood and go, I don't understand why these people don't want to participate in this trial. Or, I don't really want to go to the doctor because I don't know what they're going to be putting in me. Once you actually grapple with the reality, some of it comfortable and some of it not, you can then actually design studies. You can then actually get people to participate in a way that they have not. It's my belief. Now, the lack of diversity leads to a lack of generalizable data. It's ridiculous. I won't even quote the number, but I mean, it is the number of underrepresented minorities on clinical trials just in general is low, but it gets even lower when you start talking about things around cancer. I mean, it's ridiculous. And it hasn't been just low just yet. It's been low for like 40 years. And yet every year we say, yep, numbers are low. Mm-hmm. Next decade comes. Numbers are low. Mm-hmm. Next 10 years passes. Wow, Jed, the numbers are low. But when is it that we're going to sort of say that we've had enough of sort of having just low numbers and figure out what is the science behind, what is the knowledge behind, what is the effort behind to make sure that both women and various different populations feel comfortable enough to do this. This is the one time in history that I'm going to tell you this. I'm comfortable. Things have been done to us. And so I can understand why you wouldn't want things done to you. But the unfortunate problem is, in this case, if you're not at the table, you will be on the menu. And that also goes with some other things that'll be happening over the next several years, but we're going to talk about that too. Right? But if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So there is a level of making sure and ensuring that we have our voices at the table. Because in the promise of precision medicine, there's a promise that as we're figuring things out, if we as a people decide to sit on the sidelines, this is the one time where we, by our inactions, are increasing our disparities. I'll say that again, because I don't know if you heard it. And I know y'all saying that this guy must have had a Baptist preacher, somebody in his family. But from what it is, I'm going to say it. This is the one time where the lack of participation, the lack of our own individual participation, could increase disparities. So as we're coming up with more miracle drugs, and as we're coming up with all these things, we don't know whether it applies to you or not. So there will be a call for all of us to participate more. Because with that knowledge, with that data, there comes the potential of being able to help. Now, really, I only got a couple more slides, so I'm going to leave y'all alone. You're like, get this dude up off the stage. I got it. Right? I'll give you one quick example. And why lung cancer? Because as you think of ovarian cancer, and we think of breast, and we think of other things, we all know that that's also associated with obesity, which has effects on arthritis and other things like that, but it also has an impact on cancers. Not lost on me. Not lost on me. Now, give you a quick example. The National Lung Cancer Screening Trial, which is a wonderful trial, that said, listen, lung cancer in the 70s and 80s, we tried to screen with our chest x-rays and a little sputum, and we couldn't figure out anything. We couldn't figure out what to do. It didn't work. They stumbled upon this trial, which they said, listen, we're going to actually have a low-dose CAT scan. We're going to do it annually for 3 years, and we're going to actually include men age 55 who had 30 pack years worth of smoking. The wonderful part about this story is that for the first time, it gave us hope that we can actually detect cancer and do something about it. And with the screening procedure, just like breast and other things, we were able to reduce mortality by 20%. Now, you're talking about a cancer that for my decade of training, when I was at University of Michigan and when I was at Colorado and Chicago, all the rest of these places, I was just like, well, you have lung cancer. Alaska sounds good, huh? You want to go take a trip there? Right? All the way from that to we can find it, detect it, and do something about it. So that sounds great. Except for when you start looking and you've recognized that the National Lung Cancer Screening Trial, the most wonderful trial, the participants did not reflect all of us. Very, very few women were in that study. And interestingly enough, less than 4% African Americans were in that study. The interesting thing in my clinical practice, I see sometimes, especially African American men at younger ages. In fact, I just had a 47-year-old with a 20-pack year smoking that ultimately has stage 4. So the truth of the matter is, I'm not certain if our data is so precise that it applies to all. Our participation really does count. Now, not having a diverse population and diverse participation in these studies, in some ways, in my mind, further increases the disparities between gender, between race, and between, you can keep it going. We must grow up and know that it's all of us, and getting information from all of us is the best way to move forward, even if it's not for us, for our kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews. That the information we know and the information we find out has the potential to be good and do good. Got just a couple more slides. Why being seen, why being at the table matters? Because as I thought about the National Lung Cancer Screening Trial, and I can go to some other, things like diabetes, cardiovascular, we could go, and even arthritis, but these are the slides I had. I know that on my south and west side of town that I have some wards, which are made up, Chicago's made up of about 50 wards. I have some wards where, get this, no one should die from cervical cancer, but I have 2.5 times the death rate in a ward, in some of my wards in Chicago than I do in the country. Lung cancer. In some cases, I have at least a handful of wards, less than a handful, maybe 4 or 5 wards. Usually, typically, as it says, that the redder it gets and the browner it gets, that's the worse it gets. But I have a couple wards in Chicago where the death rate from lung cancer is over twice what it is in the country. And I can keep going on and on and on. There's a point where I do another talk, where I had to stop showing the slide. Because no one should die from cervical cancer, for sure. But they're preventable cancers, prostate, breast, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, in my wards, I will walk and sometimes see 3 times the mortality, the death rate. That's not incidence. That's real. And then say, well, what is it that we're doing? So, it matters that we are all seen. And it matters that we are all at the table. And for me, it really matters that as the president rolls out, ideally now in December, we're hoping, when he rolls out this precision medicine initiative, this All of Us initiative, that it stays intact, and that when it rolls out, that we give it all of what we have in participating in it, so that there is an element that could be used literally to benefit all of us. So from my perspective, I'm going to end with this slide, that we used to think about engaging communities as being nice. Well, that would be nice. It's good to engage the community, right? But I think we have to get beyond the good to engage communities to necessary, and that there is a science that's also associated with sitting down across from the table and understanding what motivates and why people do it. We can do it with tobacco smoke, cigarette companies, and all the rest of these other things. It's interesting that for the very things that can actually benefit us, that we don't take that same amount of time. So I'm going to make the pitch that you do have something that's about to come down, something that I believe hopefully had bipartisan support. Hopefully we'll continue to have bipartisan support. And this is the one effort, the one initiative that President Obama has started that I hope we will see to its end. And I hope that you all will, in some small part, also sort of contribute to the success. So with that, I'll take any questions that you might have. But I think we're on the verge of doing something great.